Do you ever wonder where those clothes you donated end up? We'll get ready to find out, including the economic impositions and effects internationally. We begin our journey in Africa, during the 1970s when this country was the major source for sweatshops. Due to the fact that they were labor abundant, it was their comparative advantage to have sweatshops. This avenue for production was the foundation of developing a better quality of life because it offered alternative employment to the poor paid agricultural laborers. This provided stepping stones that developed Singapore and Hong Kong to the growing economic superpowers of today. So what happened? Why isn't Africa any more prosperous than it was 40 years ago? Due to the Fair Trade Act of 1970 by GATT and the various World Health Organizations, in accord with the International Labor Organization, intensification of the occupational health and safety standards for countries and companies occurred. Since these infrastructures had a strong influence on the sweatshops in Africa, it made cheap production difficult and resulted in the movement of sweatshops to developing Asian countries and Middle Eastern countries. Fast forward to 2012. Americans throw away more than 68 pounds of clothing and textiles per person per year, which either ends up in landfills, thrift shops, or becomes secondhand clothing. This is where our story begins. Have you ever heard of overlapping demand? Essentially, it's when products are intended and are sold within the domestic market and eventually will appeal to a small group in a foreign market. Entrepreneurs begin seeing this opportunity provided due to the excess amount of clothing Americans consume as a way to create a route for indirect arbitrage. This is because the retail stores will bundle the salvage or defective products to a thrift store for the thrift store to sell the itemized product for a little less than the market value, creating a profit well above the bundled price. This process continues all the way to Africa, allowing multiple corporations opportunities to profit and create jobs beyond the retail market. One person's trash is another person's treasure. Secondhand clothing is very controversial because it brings up the question of where the clothes are ending up and who benefits. For example, Humana, a non-profit secondhand clothing company located in Spain, redistributes recycled clothing to finance developed cooperation projects in Africa. But not all of the clothes end up in developing countries. Many believe they are doing their good deed of the day to help clothe a poor child in Africa, and are upset to learn their clothes could end up being resold to vintage shops and rarely go to even the local community in need. Though non-profit, Humana has to make money to pay for transportation and fixed costs somehow, and this process is how it best uses its resources at hand. If you want your donation to go to someone in need in your local community, the best option would be to donate directly to a homeless or family shelter.
So let's say you donate a bag of clothing to one of Humana's branches here in the U.S., like Planet Aid or Use Again. Afterwards, the contents of the container are separated by quality and condition of each article of clothing, and then either relocated to one of its thrift stores here in the U.S. or sent abroad. Yet, only 1% of clothing end up in vintage shops, and an average American only purchases 10 pounds of recycled clothing per year. Once sent abroad, rag merchants sort through the clothing and bid on materials to be then smuggled because of high trade restrictions or sold into second-hand clothing markets. One may not realize how important fashion has become because of the influence of Western lifestyle. For example, in Nigeria, the imports of second-hand clothing is illegal because it's believed to be detrimental to the local clothing economy, but merchants find a way to smuggle it across borders, and the government is the one losing out on taxes from the imported goods. This loss is fulfilled by the competitive producers in China who can produce fast fashion for a very competitive low price.
Like in America, this cheap clothing alternative will eventually be the future of fashion in Africa. Lastly, we want to share with you where the inspiration for this topic came from by reading an excerpt from The Blue Sweater by Jacqueline Novogratz. It all started with the blue sweater, the one my Uncle Ed gave me. He was like Santa to me, even in the middle of July. Of soft blue wool with stripes on the sleeves and an African motif across the front, two zebras walking in front of a snow-capped mountain. The sweater made me dream of places far away. I wrote my name on the tag to ensure that it would be mine forever. And then my high school nemesis ruined everything. One Friday afternoon, the captain of the football team had asked me on a date right there in the middle of the hall. And there was that mean kid standing right beside me, talking to boys from the junior varsity football team about the first ski trip of the winter. He stared at my sweater and yelled, "We don't have to go anywhere to ski. We can do it on Mount Novogratz," pointing at my chest. That afternoon, I marched home and announced to my mother that the vile sweater had to go. She drove me to the Goodwill and we disposed of the sweater. I was glad to never see it again and tried to forget it. Fast forward to early 1987. 25 years old, I was jogging up and down the hilly streets of Kigali, Rwanda. I came to the country to help establish a microfinance institution for poor women. From out of nowhere, a young boy walked towards me, wearing the sweater. My sweater, the beloved but abandoned blue sweater. He was perhaps 10 years old, skinny, with a shaved head and huge eyes, not more than 4 feet tall. Still, there was no doubt. This was my sweater. I grabbed him by the shoulders and turned down the collar. Sure enough, my name was written on the tag of my sweater that had traveled thousands of miles for more than a decade. The blue sweater had made a complex journey from Alexandria, Virginia to Kigali, the capital of Rwanda. It would have to arrive after being fumigated and packed into 100-pound bales along with other pieces of cast-off clothing. The bales would have been sold to second-hand clothing distributors who would allow retailers to discard the useless pieces and buy what they thought they could sell.
The story of the blue sweater had always reminded me of how we are all connected. Our actions and interactions touch people that we may never know or never meet across the globe. So here we have examined the pros and cons of secondhand clothing and the recycling process of these textiles, and we have chosen to leave our opinions out because of how controversial this topic is. We urge you to research the clothing companies you support by using your dollar vote and moral compass wisely.